Jersey robocalls on the Republican side from John McCain, Mitt Romney, Rudy Giuliani, but however many times President Obama went down to Virginia, it was that many more times than he came to New York. He did not campaign for William Thompson at all. That is shocking, considering you could almost just say stunningly close race. Tom Robbins, talk about what happened in New York. Bloomberg versus Thompson. We saw one of the big upsets of standard wisdom and conventional thinking last night. Every poll going into last night had the mayor winning re-election by at least double digits. Some of them were almost as high as 20%. This is a mayor who spent more than any incumbent or any non-incumbent official ever in history. We think it's going to be $100 million. He got about 500,000 votes. We think that's going to translate into 200 votes that he paid, $200 per vote that he paid. It's an absolutely amazing failure of big money in a campaign. And it says something. We don't know what it says about Bill Thompson, but it certainly says something about how New Yorkers feel about this mayor headed into a third term.
But, Tom, what I was struck by was the astonishingly low turnout. About 1.1 million New Yorkers voted. There are 4 million registered. That means 25% of the electorate turned out in this vote. So I think the mayor may come into office with the lowest vote total in modern history of any mayor of New York City. But talk about that turnout and what it means.
Well, you know, it's illustrative of the same fact that the mayor couldn't turn out votes for himself. He couldn't turn out people to the polls at all. And people reported getting as many as a dozen robocalls from the mayor, I got robocalls from Al Gore on this guy that were put together with his voice on it. This was an all-out push by the mayor to barrage New York voters that he had on his list as potential.
Al Gore for the Republican-turned-independent.
Well, to be fair here, Al Gore had an appearance with Mike Bloomberg right before the election in which he said very nice things about the Republican mayor, and the mayor used that clip over and over again in his robocalls, indicating that he had the support. He did the same thing with Bill Clinton. He did a string of quotes that he patched together from prominent Democrats to try to show how much support, and yet they didn't come to the polls. I mean, to go to Juan's point, they didn't even turn out, which shows that, I mean, two things. One is they were not excited about Bill Thompson, who was, I think, a fairly lackluster candidate in many ways, but they also were less excited about re-electing Mike Bloomberg.
And, of course, the big issue for many voters was that Bloomberg had overturned term limits. He'd gotten the city council, despite 2 referendums setting term limits, to overturn the limits last year so that he could run for a third term.
I don't think anybody really understood how angry New Yorkers were until last night about that move. I mean, there was some reflection of it in the Democratic primary last month when we saw 2 Democrats win office, both of whom had been militant opponents of extending term limits, John Liu for comptroller and Bill de Blasio for public advocate. But it wasn't clear whether or not that was going to carry over to Bloomberg. To some extent, he seemed sort of Teflon on this issue because of the fact that he had had a fairly successful, what's perceived as a successful record as mayor. Last night's results show that that wasn't true. I mean, there's no question that the fact that the anger over term limits and his incredibly profligate spending really annoyed New Yorkers, and they showed it.
Well, Juan, let's talk about that. We're talking about $100 million that it is believed that Bloomberg spent of his own money. I think William Thompson spent something like $8 million. The airwaves blanketed with ads for Bloomberg, or I should say against William Thompson. But that $100 million doesn't reflect all the money that went into this campaign. You've been looking at this one.
I mean, I think the unwritten story is that I think Michael Bloomberg has now spent in his 3 runs for mayor of New York, not just about $70 million each time and $100 million this time for the races themselves, but the amount of philanthropic money that he has given to nonprofits in New York City is astounding. It was reported that Calvin Butts, the minister of one of the biggest black churches in New York City, Abyssinian Baptist Church, received a $1 million personal donation from Michael Bloomberg. Jeffrey Canada, who runs a bunch of Harlem charter schools, received a $600,000 personal donation from Michael Bloomberg. You can't
And the role Canada played in Obama not coming to New York?
Well, reportedly, the New York Times reported today that Canada called Valerie Jarrett at the White House in recent days to try to persuade Barack Obama not to campaign for Bill Thompson, the Democrat, and that Valerie Jarrett and the people in the White House operatives assured Canada that the president would stay out of New York, would not campaign for Bill Thompson, the Democrat.
And he was right here, Obama, because he came here for the weekend for Corzine.
He was here in New York, and he was also campaigning in New Jersey, but he agreed not to campaign. So you had a situation where these personal donations that the mayor has been giving to virtually you named a nonprofit in New York, and they all have an anonymous donation that they all know is from Michael Bloomberg. So he has been essentially buying the entire nonprofit community of New York City, donating at least $100 million a year of his personal money in philanthropic contributions for the last decade. So I think the combination of his philanthropic giving and his own political campaign spending means that that he has spent money like no one in history has ever spent for political office.
And, of course, Bloomberg News. I mean, we're also talking about the media here, Tom Robbins.
Yeah, he's ever present. I mean, this is a man who named, a television station or radio station, and now he's got Business Week magazine. Maybe he'll change that to Bloomberg Business Week. We'll see what happens. I mean, his ability to be able to use his money, certainly in effective ways. I mean, the fact that he was able to, some people, Corzine, who's also a incredibly wealthy individual, was not able to get there. Bloomberg has used his money to be able to reach people that he knew, like Canada, like Calvin Butts, people who he knew were influential and that he could basically, I don't know if he buy their support, but he could use it, as Calvin Butts said to a Bloomberg biographer earlier this year, it sure doesn't hurt to be able to get that money.
And the union's closeness to Obama and not coming out for William Thompson won?
Well, you had two of the biggest, most powerful unions in New York City, the Teachers Union and the SEIU 1199 union. Both of them stayed out of the race. Unusual for these powerful unions that are always the kingmakers in many of the political races. They stayed out of the races, which was in effect, again, helpful to Mayor Bloomberg in his efforts. So when you look at that 5% margin, given the fact that the entire political establishment of New York, virtually all of the newspapers, dailies and weeklies, with the exception of the black-owned Amsterdam News and the Spanish language El Diario, supported Bloomberg, and that the major unions and the National Democratic Party basically turned its back on the race. It's astonishing that it was so close.
Of course, William Thompson would have been the second African-American mayor of New York. We're talking about now a 50,000 vote difference. Obama coming out for the former CEO of Goldman Sachs over and over, John Corzine, coming here repeatedly over the last weeks for different events, but not campaigning for William Thompson.
Listen, you certainly could have a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking about this in terms of the White House's role, but I think there's a couple of things going on for President Obama. One is, I think that he looks at Mike Bloomberg still as a potential presidential candidate himself. Remember, he almost ran in 2008. He thought very seriously of it, and he still could throw a monkey wrench into the 2012 elections if he decided to just spend his money, whether or not he'd be a viable candidate or not, or he could try to get involved in the midterm elections. So I think for Obama, there was a certain, do I want to really get this guy mad at me? Do I want to make myself a target for him, particularly on behalf of a candidate who everybody thinks is not going to win? And he's reading the same polls we are, the same polls that Bill Thompson was reading, that he was double digits behind.